Okay, so we were talking about the idea, the halacha from the perspective of the borrower, and we mentioned that there's this halachic imperative not to borrow money if you don't need it for essential needs for your parnasa, for your business. You're not really supposed to take a loan in order to go on vacation, right? You're not supposed to take a loan. You're not supposed to borrow money from a friend in order to, you know, to do something that is non-essential. And if a person were to do that and then lose the money, he would be in violation of the Torah. And we had started seeing this likutim. Amru Chazal, Asay Shabbat Chachol Val Pitzarech Labrios. He says, our sages tell us that it's better to make your Shabbos like a weekday than to be reliant on others for income. Lahainu Misha Hasha Duchukalo Biyoser. We're talking about a person who's really under financial stress. Umari She'enlo Mashkonos Lilvos Alehen. And he doesn't have collateral to provide to others. And he's not able to borrow money without a mashkon. Because if he, if the that Gemara is talking about begging for money, not borrowing money. He says, because if you could borrow money in order to have Oneg Shabbos, then you would be obligated to do so. In other words, even though you're not supposed to borrow money for frivolous reasons, but borrowing money for the sake of having a nice Shabbos experience, there's a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos. So that is a justifiable reason to borrow money. That our sages even make an explicit statement that God says that for the sake of Shabbos, I give you permission to borrow money, and I guarantee you I'll provide you with the wherewithal to pay back. And you should place your trust in God that Hashem will help you pay back the loan. So it turns out that there are certain mitzvahs, like for example, if a person needs to buy a lulav and esrog before Sukkot, and he simply can't afford it, it is justifiable to borrow money for that purpose. Some say that even for Shabbos, you should not borrow money unless you know that you know how you have a plan for how you'll get the money to pay it back. Okay, so, and then he finishes off by saying, Hakol lefi ha'inyan, which means it's a subjective issue. You have to take each thing on a case by case. That doesn't really help us that much. So what you clearly see from here is that there's plenty of gray area over here. Okay. Yeah. Like what if he wants to do the hitter mitzvah? He could get by with buying a cheap one, but he says no. Nothing is too important for my lulav and esrog. Like no price is too high for my lulav and esrog, so therefore lend me the money. Obviously at some point it becomes a little bit absurd. Okay. So we had said that when the malva recognizes that the lova is not the kind of person who borrows responsibly, it is better not to lend such a person money. But I think we also talked about the idea that when a debtor genuinely borrowed for need and thought that he would pay it back, and then he can't pay it back because the business went mechula, he's considered an anus. He's not doing an aveira, and he doesn't have to hire himself out. We talked about that as well. So let's go on. We also said that any money that the debtor acquires, any assets that the debtor requires, he must use to service the debt. He has to use that. He can't use that after he's taking care of his essential needs. He's got to do whatever he can to pay back the debt. So So let's see here. Doesn't have to hire himself out. Even though he's called a person who borrows money, and the pasuk does call him a bad person because he borrowed money and couldn't pay it back. But even though he says, and like the Imrei Yaakov says, even though he's an anus, the pasuk still applies to him, and he should feel bad about the fact that he can't pay back. So even though we can't obligate a person to get a second job in order to pay back the loan, like we said before, but nonetheless, logic would dictate that he should do whatever he can to remove the stigma of being a deadbeat who doesn't pay back his loans. Okay. Well, that's the next part. In other words, we said he's not obligated to work, but he does have to liquidate all his assets. Kol mamon sheyagia liyado. That's the next part. V'hiskinu hagaonim shemashpiyim esalo v'kein shel Torah b'nekitas chayfetz. The Gaonim instituted a halacha that if a person is brought to Beis Din because he owes money, and the creditor has a promissory note, and the debtor says, it's true, I owe him the money, but I have nothing with which to pay him back. And the creditor says, I don't believe you. I think you're hiding money. And so, he says, it could be, that's the same way that people evade the tax man. The CRA is that they'll give the money to their children or whatever else they're going to do. So the Gaonim made a takana that we make the debtor take a shavua in Beis Din, like holding a Tanakh, she'ein lo klum yoser al mashem mesadrin lo, that he doesn't have more than what he says he has. V'shelo hechbi biyad acher, and he didn't hide his assets by giving it to others. V'shelo nasan matan al manas lahachzir, and he didn't give people gifts with the objective of when the heat is off, you'll give it back to me. V'ayin belikutim shehevenu din shibuda de Rabbi Nasan. That we'll take a look in the Likutim momentarily. There's a concept called shibuda de Rabbi Nasan. Now, what does that mean? Tanya Rabbi Nasan Omer, minayin lenosha bechavero mana, bechavero b'chavero, shemotzin mizeh v'nosnim lazeh, talmud loymar v'nasan la'asher asham lo. Rabbi Nasan says, let's say you have three people, okay? Reuven lent money to Shimon, and Levi owes money to Shimon. And Shimon doesn't have the wherewithal to pay back Reuven. Reuven has a right to go to Levi, who's Shimon's debtor, and collect the debt from Levi directly. And even though normally that wouldn't work, Rabbi Nasan and I guess his Beis Din instituted this halacha based on the pasuk that you have to give to whoever has been defrauded of their money, which means even though I didn't borrow Levi, we say to Levi, even though you didn't borrow the money from Reuven, you borrowed it from Shimon, but Shimon will be made whole by you paying back to Reuven, because you're going to pay off Shimon's debt and you'll pay it to Reuven. So we do allow Reuven to go directly to Levi to collect the debt. And that's the reason why this is relevant to this halacha, is because let's say a guy hides away assets by giving away money to one of his kids. And he says, I don't have what to pay you with. Well, did you give the money to one of your children? Well, yeah, but it was a matana. No, sorry. We have a right now to collect from your child the money that you squirreled away to him. Okay. So what do you have to leave for the debtor? Like, what is the minimum that you have to leave for him? As long as he has enough food for 30 days and clothes for 12 months, every other asset he has to surrender to service the debt. And also a bed and furniture that he can sit on. And also the needs of the bed, blankets, pillows. And this is all explained in the Shulchan Aruch explicitly, what you have to leave the debtor with, but you can take away all the other things. As long as he has a basic table, chair, bed, couch, everything else goes. You take away all of his artwork, you take away everything else in order for him to pay off what he owes. Almanas shelo lifroa. So hold on a second. Um, let's see. Right. So, and also we had said that any money that comes into the debtor's hand, once he becomes liable to pay back the loan, he has to surrender to the malveh and only leave for himself enough that he has food for 30 days and clothes for 12 months from the time that the money reached his hands. Unless the money was given to him on the condition that he doesn't use this money to pay back the debt. In other words, if I see this guy is living in squalor because he's liquidated all of his assets to pay back the debt, and he still has a lot of money to pay back, and I want to give him, I want him to have a little bit of something. I want to buy him a new suit for Yantiv. So I say to him, I'm buying you a new suit for Yantiv, but you cannot sell this after I give it to you to pay back your debt. So then he has a right to keep it. Okay? Almanas shelo lifroa mimenu. Isa b'shulchan aruch mishad tzarach labriot b'shat achar parnasaso v'nasnu lo tzedakah. He says that if a person is really downtrodden financially and someone ends up giving him tzedakah, ein balei chovos yicholim liipar mimenu mima shegava b'tzedakah. Then his creditors cannot confiscate the property that he got from tzedakah to service the debt. Unless when he was collecting the money, that it said explicitly at the time of his collection that he owes other people money. Because then it's clear that the people who gave him tzedakah gave it to him so that he could pay off his debt. I forget who this Haga is. The Vilna Gaon, however, disagrees, and he says that if a person even collects tzedakah money, he can use it. The creditors have a right to confiscate that money in order to be paid back, even if the people who gave him the tzedakah didn't know that they were giving money to this guy so that he could pay off his creditors.
It's explicitly saying, no.
Right, unless they explicitly said, like the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, unless they when they gave him, they explicitly said, do not use this to pay back the debt. Okay. Okay. And then
What about the shelter? What about
yeah, I mean, that's what we had seen. We saw a couple of days ago that he's obligated to sell even his house in order to pay the debt, and then he'll have to rent. He'll have to rent from that point forward. Yeah. I would think so.
Because food, clothing, and shelter are necessities.
Yeah, I think, where did we see this? We saw that his real estate also has to be used to service the debt. I know we saw it. I would think so as well. maybe we'll see it again. And so
if he's married, he gets that obligation to his wife, and hence, we need enough money to do that too.
well, we said uchsus yud beis chodesh lo levado v'lo levana v'ishto, but not to his children and his wife. Afal pi shechayiv b'mezonoseha, even though he's obligated to provide her with food, but the creditor is allowed to take everything. Yeah. Which is, again, surprising. In other words, yeah, he can't make the argument, well, what's my wife going to eat? So she'll have to collect from tzedakah, I guess is the argument. Which is pretty harsh, right? We did see. To him alone, v'lo levanav v'ishto, but not for his children and his wife, even though he's obligated to feed her food and clothing. In other words, it's not that we don't take away her clothing, we don't take away his kids' clothing, but we don't give them, we don't say you can hold on to money to buy her future clothing, to buy her future food. No, we only give you enough for 30 days food, and they'll have to get the money from tzedakah. So that, I guess, because we award rights to the creditor. Now, certainly a creditor with compassion is going to look past the halacha, all right? But this halacha is addressing what rights the creditor has, and the creditor does have a right to force the debtor to liquidate everything down to the bare minimum, which is why it's always a good idea not to borrow money, because you don't want to ever be in no one would ever want to be in that situation. But sometimes there's no choice. And then we said, and to determine how much clothing and food he's entitled to, you estimate based on what a middle-class person of that community would be eating and wearing, not based on what the wealthy people or what the poor people wear. Even if he himself was either wealthy or poor, you base the award of what he can be left with based on what a middle-class person would be, that standard. That's right. It is different from tzedakah. Ka'ani demasha hayaragil etzamseim nafsho haya kedei lefarnes me hamosar livnei beso. Masha ein kein ata ein tzarach lahariv nafsho bishvil amalva. He says, because in the past, let's say he would get by with very, very little. Maybe that was in order to provide for his family, but he's not obligated to reduce his standard of living. It's one thing for him to reduce his standard of living for the sake of his family, but he's not obligated to reduce his standard of living in order to service the debt. Okay. We'll see a little bit more in the Likutim and the Biurim. We'll get maybe a little bit more clarification. And then he writes, even if he's a Talmud Chacham and he needs his Sfarim in order to be able to do his job as a Rebbe, as a rabbi, he nonetheless has an obligation to sell his entire library, even his own Sefer Torah, in order to service the debt. And we know that you normally are never permitted to sell a Sefer Torah, but in order to pay off the debt, you're obligated to do so. The Havalei Kishar Nechas of the Govin Mehem. His Sfarim are no different from any other asset that are used to service a debt. The Huadin Hatalis, and even his talis, he has to sell in order to pay off the debt. Aval Tefillin Eino Chayiv Limkor. But the tefillin you don't have to sell. Why? The shiny tefillin, the Havalei Mitzvah Shebegufo B'Huchovas Gabra. He says, because your tefillin is a mitzvah that is incumbent upon your body to fulfill every day. And we don't force you to give up what is a mitzvah obligation upon yourself to perform. So why do we force you to sell your talis? So he says, Mashen Kain talis, he says the talis is not a chovas gavra. If a person does not have a four-cornered garment, they're not obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis. Uvipratim yesh lo talis katan, and surely that's true if you have a talis katan. In other words, you owe a person money, your wife bought you a beautiful talis, you got to sell the talis, sell the talis bag. I don't know how much you're going to get for it, but we're talking about extreme situations. Look, a lot of this is not that practical, right? Let's face it. The community would step in. Just speaking of which, I was so, because we're so involved in these halachas about the mitzvah of lending people money, I just checked it yesterday to find out what our balance was in the Free Loan Society that we opened an account for. So we still owed about a little bit over $8,000. So I just authorized a check for $5,000 from the tzedakah account, and then we'll pay the rest over the course of time. But she sent me a report. 3 people from our shul, since we opened that account, have already used our money to take out small loans. I think they lend up to $5,000. Yeah, and it gets recycled. In other words, this money all gets recycled. So it's a great thing. I mean, when you give money to that pushka in the morning at davening, that money has been going to the poor and to fund this, plus to give out distributions before Rosh Hashanah and Purim and Pesach. But we had a little bit of extra money, so I used it to service the free loan account. So I hope you feel good about it. Okay. Vafilu Sefer Torah. You even have to sell a Sefer Torah. Because of Hashach, Dafilu im Huchnas a Sefer Torah behechal beis hakneses. He says, even if you leave your Sefer Torah in the shul, right? A lot of people do that. They will commission a Sefer Torah, and then they'll let the shul use it, right? But it's still my Sefer Torah. It's got my name on the mantle, right? So the creditor has a right to go to shul, and he's obviously got to let someone know that I'm not stealing this Sefer Torah, but I'm collecting it as part of the debt. Now, Sefer Torah could be, even a used Sefer Torah could be upwards of $10,000-$20,000. So nami rashai bal chov legabos mizeh chovo imlo matzah legabos mimokam acher. If he can't find a way to pay it off from some other source, which is an amazing idea. What about the Hachnas Sefer Torah you just did a year ago? Oh, I can't give you that. That belongs. No, it doesn't belong to the shul. It's still got your name on it. We all know that. So use that to pay me back. The davka shelo hikdisho befeirush ela asa chinuch l'sefer Torah v'ichnisa lahechal beis hakneses. But that's only when you dedicated the Sefer Torah, you did not give it to the shul outright, but rather you did a hachnasa Sefer Torah, and you just keep it in the shul. He says, and you didn't say explicitly that you're dedicating it and giving it away to the shul, right? But let's say you gave it to the shul, and you said this is permanently going to remain in the shul for all perpetuity. So then, ein bal chov yachol legabos mimenu. He says, then the creditor does not have a right to use it to collect the debt. The hektish haguf mafkia midei shibud v'ayin likut. Because when you make something hektish, by saying it belongs to the shul now, so then even though it was originally yours, but you declared it to be now the property of hektish, because you said it belongs to the shul, so that can remove. If you take an asset and you make it hektish, it removes it from being able to be used to service a debt.
How far that goes? Does one get accuracy or gift to the client? Is actually to give a gift to the shul and then
you could, if you donate outright a Sefer Torah to the shul, you are entitled to a receipt. But the reason why people do not get a receipt is because they want to keep it. They want it to be their property, but you can't. Right, that would be the evidence. You're right. But you can't have it both ways. We've had a situation where a person wanted to get a tax receipt for the Sefer Torah, but then the question is, so are you giving it to the shul? Oh, no, I'm not giving it to the shul, but you can use it for as long as you want. Sorry, that doesn't qualify as a gift to the shul. Okay. The Ein Sarach Lomar base dira. This is where we saw it, Lloyd. This is where we saw it. And also, you've got to sell your property, even where you live, in order to service the debt. So the Imrei Yaakov says, Yesh Omrim, the Eino Yachol Hotziu mi beis dira shalosh shadarba ad yud beis chodesh. That some say that you cannot evict someone from their home in order to collect the debt. You have to give them at least 12 months before you can evict them. Yeah, you can force them to sell, but you have to wait 12 months before you can force them to sell. You have to give them a chance. Even though the debt was due on January 1st, 2022, you have to wait until January 1st, 2023 before you can coerce them to put up the property for sale. Say you have a year. Otherwise, I'm going after everything you own, including your home, including your apartment. And then he writes, yes, you go off to, you can, this is a chiddush only by the place where he lives, right? Other real estate that he owns, that he doesn't live in, you can go after right away. Right. All of his chattel, you can go after immediately. Right. Yeah, give him the bare essentials, right? The Ein Sarach Lo, okay. And then we said v'chein Ela im kein mochalo hamalva miritzono masha mochalo. But of course, the malva, the creditor, does have a right to say, all right, listen, I'm not going to kick you out of your apartment, live in your apartment. I'm not going to require you to sell it. Or he can say, I'm not going to require you to sell off your items. He can, the malva certainly has the discretion to be benevolent, even when he's putting pressure on him to service the loan. Aval svarim shekana levana, v'chein bigdei chol shekana lahem ala ishto v'afilu bigdei shabbos shal ishto shlokana lahu lo yiframehem chova. But any svarim that you bought for your children, or weekday clothing that you purchased for them or for your wife, and even Shabbos clothing that you already purchased for your wife, or that vafilu bigdei Shabbos shalishto shalo kanala that you didn't purchase for her but that she acquired on her own, those cannot be used to service the debt. The implication being is that if you bought her Shabbos clothing, like a beautiful gown for Shabbos, even though you already gave that to her, the creditor can confiscate that to service the debt, because that's considered to be a luxury. And even though you bought it for your wife, he's allowed to confiscate it. But other clothing, like if she has the weekday clothing, you can't confiscate. I mean, it's very sad, right? This guy's going to take away everything, the creditor. But he's entitled to it because he lent the guy money. We'll have to hold it here. We'll continue with Imrei Yaakov tomorrow.